As the 10th anniversary of Chinese President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) approaches, a spokesperson from the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry remarked, "Over the past decade, we have accumulated numerous achievements through cooperation." However, criticism towards the BRI has been escalating internationally. Many participating nations are grappling with debt crises, signaling the end of the golden era of Beijing as a financial benefactor. Once heralded as Xi Jinping's project of the century, the initiative is now sarcastically referred to as the Belt and Road to Death. On September 7th, China's Foreign Affairs Ministry announced the hosting of the third BRI summit in Beijing this coming October. The event is set to publicize the so-called successful outcomes of the initiative once more, despite expectations that leaders from Western countries will not attend. It appears that the most prominent guest might be Russian President Putin, highlighting the underlying fact that the Chinese Communist Party is attempting to market an alternative development model diverging from that of Europe and the USA. The party's venture is frequently criticized by Western countries for enticing impoverished nations into a debt trap under the guise of development, thereby expanding China's global influence. After a decade, what has this project, dubbed as a debt trap by Western nations, actually yielded? According to a survey conducted by the Associated Press on May 18th this year, over a dozen impoverished countries globally, including Zambia, Kenya, Laos, Pakistan, and Mongolia, are on the verge of economic instability, or even bankruptcy, struggling to repay tens of billions of dollars in foreign debts. In these countries, up to 50% of foreign loans originate from China, with over a third of government revenues utilized for debt repayment. Among them, Zambia and Sri Lanka have unfortunately declared bankruptcy. Since joining the BRI, the small African nation of Zambia has been ensnared in a debt trap, unable to free itself and defaulting on its debts in 2020. Its foreign debt skyrocketed to $17.3 billion, with China as its largest creditor, financing over $6 billion for large-scale infrastructure projects in the country. Taking Laos as an example, the Laos-China Railway incurred a cost of $5.9 billion, approximately one-third of Laos's total economy. 60% of the funding came from loans from the China Export-Import Bank, with the remaining 40% converted into project equity, requiring a cash equivalent investment of $730 million from Laos, of which $480 million was borrowed from the China Export-Import Bank. This accumulated to a total debt burden exceeding $1.4 billion, in a country where the GDP barely reaches $20 billion. For economically fragile developing nations, the Belt and Road Initiative represents a cruel debt trap. When debtor nations cannot fulfill their repayment obligations, the CCP leverages the debt in exchange for equity, gaining control over the debtor country's ports, airports, dams, power plants, or communication networks. Sri Lanka, one of the early adopters of the BRI, borrowed several billions of US dollars from China. Despite lacking justified and urgent reasons, Sri Lanka agreed to heavy borrowing at high interest rates, allowing China to construct a new port. After the new port incurred operational losses, Sri Lanka had no choice but to sign a 99-year lease agreement, handing over the port to a Chinese state-owned enterprise. Yet, this arrangement did not settle the debt, forcing Sri Lanka into a cycle of taking on new debts to pay off old ones. The African nation of Djibouti has conceded the Durale port to the CCP, which promptly militarized the civilian port, bolstering the local military base established there by constantly deploying more warships and stationed forces. In 2019, the CCP had planned to invest in a deep-water port project in Myanmar, with a total investment amounting to $7.3 billion. Shockingly, after soliciting help from the United States to review the contract, the Myanmar government discovered that as much as $6 billion were inflated costs, with the actual required investment only standing at $1.3 billion. Presently, numerous regions are witnessing stalled Chinese projects that were left unfinished, such as the highway in Montenegro. Unable to repay a debt of $1 billion to China, the project came to a halt, attracting ridicule as the road to nowhere, a phenomenon mirrored in several other countries. A January report from the Wall Street Journal underscored the impending quality risks confronting many large-scale BRI projects in various nations. Examples include Ecuador's Coca-Codo Sinclair hydroelectric power station exhibiting thousands of cracks, Pakistan's Neelam Jhelum hydroelectric plant being forced to shut down due to safety risks, and over 500 construction defects discovered at Uganda's Isimba hydroelectric station. Resulting outcomes indicate that the Belt and Road Initiative, far from being a route to peace, prosperity, openness, innovation, and civilization, as proclaimed by the CCP, has manifested as a path of strife, corruption, falsity, and darkness. Recently, Italy, the only G7 country that joined the BRI, was compelled to admit that joining was an atrocious decision, with predictions circling of an imminent announcement of its withdrawal. As reported by the Italian media outlet HuffPost on September 5th, Deputy Prime Minister Tajani, during a recent visit to China, indirectly hinted at a necessary exit from the BRI during discussions, despite not stating it outright to Beijing. On September 10th, while attending the G20 summit in India, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni stated that a final decision regarding withdrawal from China's BRI had not yet been made. However, according to Italian media, Meloni personally informed Chinese Premier Li Qiang about plans to exit the BRI initiative, with Li attempting to persuade Meloni to reconsider. Initiated and led by the CCP government after Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, the transnational economic belt encompasses the historic Silk Road and Maritime Silk Road, involving mainland China, Central Asia, Northern Asia, Western Asia, as well as countries along the Indian Ocean, in South America, and the Atlantic region. The BRI seems to be a massive global economic initiative orchestrated by the CCP, facilitating collaborations between Chinese state-owned enterprises and local governments for infrastructure development, thus channeling China's surplus capacity and capital abroad. In reality, the BRI is far from being a pure economic endeavor. It harbors potent political motives, serving as a tool for China to export its ideologies and values, exert political influence, and strive to establish a community of shared future for mankind, under its dominion as propagated by the CCP. In what seems to be a gigantic political trap, Xi Jinping's administration has vehemently reiterated that the BRI is different from Western colonialism and is not about giving red envelopes, but focuses on joint consultation, construction, and sharing. Moreover, being backed by capital guaranteed by the CCP, the government is ready to generously write off certain debts should any issues arise. However, as the saying goes, there's no such thing as a free lunch. All of these are political calculations by the CCP, setting a monumental political trap. Through the BRI project, Beijing aims to expand its international political and economic influence. Meanwhile, those who fall into this trap are bound to compromise universal values such as human rights, democracy, and freedom. Today, compared to a decade ago, the BRI is viewed with increasing skepticism, with participating countries harboring dwindling hopes. Apart from being ensnared in a debt crisis, 1/3 of the BRI projects are plagued by scandals involving corruption, labor violations, environmental hazards, and public protests. Debt crisis in these countries is not good news for China. These bad debts have led to China becoming the world's largest creditor for the first time. Reports indicate that between 2016 and 2021, the United States' global share of creditor rights decreased to 2%, while China's soared to 30%. A recent commentary in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung noted that loans offered by China to African nations have plummeted from a peak of $28 billion to $7 billion before the outbreak of the pandemic in 2019, a steep decline of 75%. The commentary suggested that Beijing might have realized that many impoverished nations possibly lack the ability to repay these loans. In August of last year, Beijing announced the waiver of 23 debt contracts for 17 African countries, amounting to approximately $140 billion. Now, if nations struggling to repay debts seek further assistance, experts analyze that the Chinese government might no longer have the ability to help. The BRI fervently led by Xi Jinping has resulted in an international abandoned project crisis. As the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative encounters historic setbacks, a consensus was reached on September 9th during the G20 summit among leaders including US President Biden and Indian Prime Minister Modi to establish a new India-Middle East-Europe corridor, or IMEC. During the announcement of the agreement, President Biden remarked that this is a real big deal, aiming to connect ports across two continents, fostering a Middle East that is more secure, prosperous, and integrated. He added that this game-changing regional investment would bring about endless opportunities in clean energy, clean electricity, and laying cables to connect communities. As per project documents, the IMEC is envisioned to consist of two independent corridors, one connecting India with the Persian Gulf as the Eastern Corridor, and another linking the Persian Gulf to Europe, constituting the Northern Corridor. The new economic corridor facilitates the transportation of goods from India to the eastern coast of the UAE via standardized containers, and thereafter to the port of Haifa in Israel through railways, from where the goods are shipped to Europe. Apart from a small segment of the railway that needs to be constructed by Saudi Arabia, the entire corridor has been completed and is slated to become operational in the near future. The project harbors an even grander ambition. If the military regime in Myanmar permits the construction of a dedicated port, this corridor could potentially link countries such as Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. India is perceived to be the greatest beneficiary of this new economic corridor, positioning itself as the nucleus of trade flows from Southeast Asia to the Middle East and Europe. This presents a massive opportunity not only for accelerating economic development in India and the Middle East, but also for diversifying critical supply chains in Europe, steering away from China. Evidently, this project has been initiated to challenge China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched a decade ago. India has harbored a deep mistrust and stern opposition towards the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project, which passes through Kashmir, remains a primary obstacle. Furthermore, India is concerned about the approach adopted by the CCP in promoting the BRI, particularly the underlying motive of seeking to extend its influence. It has been reported that the project was initially conceived during several confidential meetings held between India, the UAE, and the US National Security Advisor, with fervent support from the Saudi Crown Prince. Italy, Germany, and France later joined the collaboration. On September 14th, Song Guocheng, a researcher at the International Relations Research Center of National Taiwan University, told the media that this essentially embodies a competitive posture in geopolitical terms. The United States is ardently backing India, with one of the goals of the new economic corridor being to complement India's rise and foster trade ties with the European Union. Song Guocheng said, during the last meeting in Washington, an almost unlimited new cooperation relationship between the two sides was established. The US has always wanted to nurture India into a regional powerhouse, and also aspires to elevate India to a permanent member of the United Nations, seizing this opportunity to reform the UN Security Council's current situation controlled by the CCP. He further noted that another paramount objective is to cultivate India into an entity capable of replacing China's position in the global supply chain as the world's factory, thereby becoming a so-called second China. This allows the US to extensively engage in offshoring, maintaining the stability of the global supply chain. This strategy is not to be evaluated over a couple of months, but possibly over 10 to 20 years. He added, in contrast, China's Belt and Road Initiative has essentially become a path of no return with tightening belts, and is at least becoming increasingly untenable.